Hello, welcome to Customer Signal, where we explore the intersection of customer experience technology and leadership with some of the most forward thinking voices in our industry. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Anuj Shah. He was head of AI at PNC Bank, one of the top banks in North America, and held other leadership roles in various financial institutions. Today, Anuj is CEO of Averas, an AI startup that's rethinking how enterprises harness AI with trust and impact. Welcome, Anuj.
Thanks for having me.
Ask. I'm actually intrigued with your career journey. So I want to spend a couple of minutes to talk about what is the turning point that has shaped your career journey and now building startup like Averas in the AI space.
Sure. So I spent most of my career at the intersection of large scale transformation in customer service, operations, and emerging technology. So I helped large financial institutions sort of transform how they interact with customers. Um, I think the one thing that, so uh, in that space, especially in my prior role, I was helping organizations leverage AI to transform how we interact internally with the customer. Um, we went through a process, and as a result of that, we were trying to roll out a large scale use case. And there were a lot of lessons learned through that process. In those lessons learned, the thing that I found was there's a gap in the marketplace where the right tool doesn't give you the right set of explainability or measurability on how to identify the gaps in implementing AI at scale and how to measure improvements as a result of the remediation. Um, so my thesis was if this exists for companies with in regulated industries with pretty well governed processes, this is going to exist for every company. So that's what led me to start Averis is singularly focused on solving that problem for organizations.
Amazing. Um, you have worked in a structured environment, and banks are particularly known for their structure. Has the decision making rhythm now versus bank has changed in any way?
Um, I'd say that there's a lot of momentum building around experimentation around AI. I'd say that said, banking is a very sensitive industry where the stakes are really high. So every decision has customer and regulatory implications. And as a result of that, banks typically banks will have to follow their risk framework. So they'll need to get model risk, operational risk, compliance, security, legal, and a host of other organizations involved in implementing a lot of these tools. So I think that rigor will still exist. I think the experimentation that's going on is great to see, but it will still have to go through that rigor in order to get something into production.
Absolutely. Um, Many banks, um, especially now, claims to have AI strategies. Yet most of the banks are stuck in the proof of concept stage. AI adoption, particularly in the finance industry, has been notoriously slow. From your past experience, what are the biggest hurdles that banks usually face to scale AI projects? Is it data silos, compliance, or just the risk appetite?
Um, I think it's a combination of all of those pieces.
Hmm.
So I think that what we'd consider slow, it has to go through, given that there are significant implications, especially if you mess up on a customer's financial record, there are significant implications associated to that.
Yeah.
Um, And as a result of that, there are processes that banks have to go through in order to get something from experimentation into production. Experimentation, we can conduct all of the experimentation that we want. And experimentation, it's easy to stand up. The thing that I've learned in my prior role and roles prior to that is that proof of concepts are really easy to stand up. It's really easy to show that you can have transformation in a handful of cases. But when you start to scale out those handful of cases to the scale at which these large global banks operate, um, there are a lot of edge cases that you need to think about. And those edge cases really matter because those edge cases are where a lot of the customer or regulatory risks come into play. And as a result of that, that's why there's a lot of these processes that have to be thought of before deploying something into production.
Yeah. Yeah. I think POC is one thing, and when you start to scale out, that's when you see the problems emerge and the edge cases. To your point, um, the next question that I have, and I have this firsthand experience working with some of the financial institutions in my past roles. Banks spend billions of dollars in digital transformation. Um, in your view, and I'm talking about mostly from the AI standpoint, which investments actually create measurable ROI, and versus some which are just hype?
Yeah. So banks have been implementing AI for quite a while. AI is involved in credit decisioning, involved in fraud, it's involved in AML. There's a full host of other back office processes that it's involved in. I think what's new about the capabilities um, that have come up since the ChatGPT moment a few years ago is we can now enhance a lot of those experiences ways that we couldn't do before.
Mm.
So I think an example is um, typically we had agents or employees go and look for information internally. So they would go into a search box, they would ask a question, or they would just type in a search term, and that tool would return a list of documents where the answer might be. So then they're sitting and they're hunting and pecking through a whole host of documents to find the potential needle in the haystack. Um, I think the thing that's changed since then is now we've got capabilities to take all of that piece of information and summarize it into just the answer and source it on where the answer came from. So that really makes a difference from a customer experience standpoint. In a lot of these instances, you have employees where the customer is literally in front of them and they're going and trying to search for information. That time spent in doing that degrades the customer experience. I think the other piece is um, a lot of people think of generative AI, the new AI, as, it's either that or traditional AI. And what I've seen is it's typically a combination. Like you take the strengths of one and you take the strengths of the other and you marry them together. Like generative AI is great at summarization, it's great at categorization, it's great at synthesis. And what is we've used a lot of those capabilities where it's very strong, and we've enhanced some of the capabilities that we have, and that combination is really what's powerful. And then what we did was we almost built that as a pattern that then you can apply to other use cases once this is done with a little bit of customization along the way. But like once you have a repeatable pattern, you can scale that across the organization. I'd say the ones that I've seen sort of fail or continue in that experimentation phase is the ones where it's broad AI transformation and didn't really have a clearly scoped use case, ROI, et cetera.
I see. Um, and in my experience, and it's not just peculiar about financial industry. It's in general, if you talk about any industry, like certain things that you can measure. But when we talk about customer experience, um, sometimes it cannot be measured in hard numbers. Um, I don't know if you have any insight on how do you measure ROI when benefits are more like experience based than the hard numbers. Any any insights into that?
Um, so I mean, there are other metrics that you can look at to quantify a lot of that. The
Mhm.
basic one that I always think of is, did this resolve the customer's issue? So you can
Mhm.
look at things like um, customer satisfaction scores. You can look at surveys. You could look at NPS. You can look at complaints data. Like a lot of those will give you insights as to what the customer's thinking. And we do use a lot of those. I always think of ROI as a combination of, what's the financial implication, what's the customer experience implication, what's the risk implication, and all three of those combined then produce ROI. So I never think of it as sort of any one of those things. And the trifecta, in my opinion, the ones that are really successful are ones that improve all three of those.
Yeah, that makes sense. Um, in banking industry, trust and explainability matters as much as speed. How do you build AI systems that customers and regulators both trust? It's a fine balance. What's your point of view on that?
Um, I think explainability really matters.
Mm,
So people seem to think that, it's the technology that we need to think about. But in my mind, um, a lot of it really is hinged upon, can I explain why a certain decision was made? And can I walk through that? Is that documented? Is it auditable? And can we actually repeat that on a time over time basis? I think that's the piece that's really critical. And that's really the piece that we focused on in our business is really like harnessing a lot of that in this new world of AI. In this new world of AI, I think it's slightly different than traditional AI in that the the inputs and outputs are different. Traditionally, there were known inputs outputs. You can ask a question, you get a very defined output. Now, and there was a finite set of questions that you can ask, and as a result of that, you had an unknown set of outputs that you can test for. In the new world and in the generative AI space, the inputs are the English language. Like you can ask a whole host of questions and get a multitude of results. Questions worded slightly differently or even the same question asked twice can
yeah.
can vary on the output. So I think that really changes the paradigm of how you need to think about controls and trust from that perspective. To me, like scale in a lot of the testing and measurability is critical in how organizations will have to think about this to move out of the experimentation phase and get something that's regulator ready to move into production.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the variability of output and compliance, it's very hard to keep that balance. And that leads to my next question. Um, Credit scoring or fraud detection, regulators are paying very close attention to AI. Like, how should banks think about governance frameworks when there's a variability to prepare for this?
So a lot of it is hinged upon banks typically have a regulatory framework that they have to follow, right?
Yeah.
So there's an operational risk framework that brings together a lot of dimensions of risk across the organization: operational risk, compliance, legal, security, third party, and there's many others that I probably didn't mention. Um, all of those need to come together, and what we what we're seeing is regulators are starting to make suggestions on that. For example, NIST has the NIST framework, which then starts to push um, guidance around controls. But I think the piece that's really critical is how you think about testing in this new world, because I think the testing piece is the really is really important because that's where a lot of the cracks will start to show up across all of these dimensions that I mentioned. And
Mm.
you really need to test at scale that you really didn't need. I don't want to say you didn't need to do it before, but I think people underestimate the scale at which we need to test now versus what we needed to test in the past.
Hmm. That's an amazing point. Like, we thought earlier the testing is hard. It's even harder now because the environment we live in and the variability. Um, but at the same time, um, the leaders are actually pushed to innovate and leverage this technology not only to improve the customer experience but improve the productivity internally. Um, so, how do you keep the balance between the guardrails from the compliance and risk management?
Yeah. So I think that there's two pieces. One is early involvement from all of those functions. So, what I've seen on projects that fail or stall is all of those functions are involved at the tail end of the process, and all of those functions, or some of those functions, then raise a red flag that derails the whole process and probably should have been thought of much earlier in the process. So, I think significantly earlier involvement, especially as you start to change the frameworks, like some of these frameworks need to be significantly changed and controls need to be built and entirely new processes may need to be stood up that haven't been thought of yet. So early involvement, I think, is critical. I think the second piece is really establishing KPIs around this. And that sounds like, we would do that in any project or any implementation. I think the critical thing is really thinking through what a good KPI or success metric is to have as a bar to move from experimentation to production. Because I think that's where a lot of organizations stall is really thinking through that and making that achievable. It's one thing to say we want 99% accuracy in completeness in a particular implementation, but there are so many nuances within that, especially as you start to think about the variability, that really thinking through those KPIs at a much more granular level is pretty significant.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing point. Identifying those stakeholders early on and aligning with their KPIs, because if they have to change something in their framework, they get enough runway to execute that. Fair point. Um, the next question is my favorite one. Um, we've seen concerns around algorithmic bias um, in credit models that are trained on legacy data. Um, with AI in credit decisioning, how do we avoid reinforcing systemic inequalities in lending?
Yeah. So as a result of some of those previous incidents, um, organizations have tried to build a lot of that into the operational risk framework. So they
Mm.
go and test for different scenarios, and they sample existing things that actually go into production to make sure that those are not happening. And I think that process will need to be continue and need to be enhanced for the scale that we're talking about with respect to AI.
Yeah, I mean, the thought process that's going on in back of my mind, and I don't know if anyone has any answer to that. That will we be ever able to trust them? 100% is a big number, but
Yeah,
maybe
yeah. I think
90%.
I mean, given the sensitivity of it, I think that those end up being pretty controlled processes that have to go through a pretty rigorous framework. So making significant changes to those um, is a pretty tall undertaking. I mean, I see, especially some of the more innovative cases, staying away from that for the time being, and then starting to move towards something like that as those get stabilized.
Yeah. So talking about customer experience and trust, I as a customer sometimes I'm in hurry and I want to do a some certain transaction, but then I have to do OTP and one time password and this and that, and it gets me frustrated. I'm like, why this is not fast enough? But on the hindsight, when anything bad happens, at that time you realize that oh, it's good to have these multi-factor authentication. So there is a balance between a speed and also human touch. So, where do you see AI delivering the most value in CX today?
I think the biggest change that I'm seeing is historically, a lot of these implementations were deterministic, right? You take what the customer's saying, you translate it to something you think you understand, and then you have a very deterministic flow off of that. So it's a very if then else. If the customer says this, that means this, then you go and execute this workflow. And I think that that's great. And that has value in very high sensitive flow, high risk flows. But you now have the ability to understand what customers are saying at a very much more nuanced level than you did before. And what would happen before is if the bot did not understand or AI did not understand, what customers were saying, it would just default to, I'm going to send you to an agent or respond with I don't know. Now you have the ability to understand um, what humans are saying at a very contextual level. Um, so what I've seen is use cases around that. So situations like agent assist, where you're calling into a call center and agents, there's a significant amount of agents, so they have to go through a significant amount of training. Um, finding the right information can be time consuming. Um, things like the AI operating in a co-pilot mode with the agent and saying, here's what I think the customer is saying. If the customer is saying this, here are some suggestions on how you can resolve this. And the agent selecting from those is pretty game changing. Not only does it make the resolution faster, but it makes the customer experience a little bit better because it starts to get a little bit more consistency around it. Um, and that sort of thing also starts to get agents a little bit up the experience curve the expertise curve as well. I think the other piece is um, banks, like most organizations, have a lot of historical data that's stored in repositories that, some of them are paper repositories or digital paper repositories. And there's no real way to harness that information. Typically you would do OCR and then you would try to make sense of all of that data. Now you can actually understand a lot of what's in there. You can take all of that data in unstructured format. You can use the generative AI capabilities to translate that to structured information. And then, you can start to use it as a they always say that data is the new oil, or the new gold. Like, this allows you to tap into the vast amounts of data that organizations have, and that gives you the ability to understand customers at a much more detailed level or a much more improved level, which has profound implications on how you can interact with customers.
Um, exactly. And I've been talking to some customers, and you see certain patterns start to emerge that they never thought had existed in their environment or in their business.
Yeah,
So definitely they can make more informed decisions and optimize their operations and processes accordingly.
that's right.
Uh, Having found this new insight, and also based on your experience and also working with Averas now, um, what do you think are some of the underutilized signals in banking that could dramatically improve customer loyalty?
Yeah. I think operational and service data is really, really important, and I think it's untapped. I mean, this is where customers interact with an organization on a very consistent basis, and they're very transparent as to what they like or don't like. And I think organizations now can use a lot of this to identify, if there are areas in the product where customers are struggling to understand, or if there's areas that or product features that customers are requesting that are not in the product right now, or if you know, if a product was just launched or a break happened, it's able to identify and categorize these at scale now to a level that we weren't able to do before. So really closing that gap and having that feedback loop back into things like product or other parts of the organization can really improve the customer experience should organizations look to tap into that.
Yeah. Um, do you think that the finance industry has fallen behind from the customer experience perspective as compared to retail or tech?
Um, I mean, I think retail and tech, given the nature and the risk associated with them, will almost always be ahead. And that's because the implication for something going wrong in the retail space or something going wrong in the tech space has very different implications than if something went wrong from a financial perspective with a customer. So I think that paradigm has existed for a while, and I think that paradigm will probably continue to exist, but I think it's there for the right reasons.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the consequences of one mistake is much larger in the finance industry as compared to um, other industries. Um, Talking about Averas, what are the problems that you're laser focused on solving right now that you felt were unresolved before?
Yeah. So I think that getting AI from a proof of concept to a production ready solution requires explainability and improvement tools that I have found to be lacking in the or I had found to be lacking in the marketplace. So think chatbot, agent assist, copilot. It's those technologies are great. I think the challenge is that really getting an understanding of how those technologies harness your company's data, and then where are situations that it can and cannot resolve, and the pieces that it cannot resolve require remediation. I think that transparency is completely lacking. And the reason I say it's lacking is you need to do that at a significant scale to really have the understanding at an aggregate level to see if something's ready to go into production. I mean, I think you need to test, organizations typically have tested, hundreds of test cases. I think the number needs to be much greater than that. And, um, that's hard to do at an organization, just simply because that process is extremely manual. What we've tried to do is we've tried to create a continuous diagnostic and improvement loop that automates identification of the gaps, point to potential remediations, and then retesting the process. We've tried to automate almost all of that stack at scale using a large amount of data, and then bringing in human in the loop where judgment's really needed so that humans can stay focused on where the judgment is required the most.
I see. You have worked in the banking industry for a while, and that's as we talked, is a highly regulated environment. How that thought process and shaping have come into the approach that you're solving problems in terms of building AI for trust, transparency, and scale.
Yeah.
Here we touched
Um,
on again.
I think that the piece that we've tried to focus on is the transparency and visibility on performance. It's what what is the AI doing? How is it making decisions? Where are their problems? What is causing the problem? And then if we remediate the problem, did it actually solve it? Like those are the elements of the stack that we've tried to focus on in order to give transparency at scale. So we do this across thousands of test cases. Um, I think that that's really important because that then gives you the visibility and confidence that you're not in experimentation anymore. Once you cross certain thresholds, you have the ability to move something into production, or it gives you the visibility that you're not ready. And there's a lot of momentum in organizations to put something into production that's AI to, raise the success flag. But I think that in certain cases, organizations are underestimating how much work this actually is or how much testing they actually need to go through to make that determination. And what we've really focused on is helping simplify and provide transparency into that process.
I see. Um, what I've seen is startups are generally pressured to ship fast, um, even when the market is not ready to absorb the message. Um, as a founder, how do you keep that balance between speed to market, product depth, um, and customer education?
Um, it's very tempting to move fast and break things, especially since that's what startups are known for. And I think our speed is probably, on par, if not better than a lot of startups. But I think the thing that we find is if we break things, then we lose the credibility. And that's really the crux of our organization is what we're trying to do is establish the credibility so that we give executives the right set of tools to make decisions on how well they're performing or what is their readiness for to implement AI at scale. So I think that's really the thing that we're focused on and making sure that we have the right set of metrics to show that that works, all backed by data is really critical.
If you had to take a bet what's the next frontier in AI in finance, what would that be?
Um, this might be a slightly controversial take. I think a lot of people talk about really, really innovative cases, and I think those are all going to become true as well. But I think the piece that's really the crux of it is the data.
Mhm.
So I think improving data quality at scale is almost a prerequisite to any of those innovative use cases coming to fruition. And given the ability that organizations to have now with this tool, with AI, to understand data at a contextual level and to actually understand and potentially improve it, um, I think that's where a lot of the unlock is going to come from. Because without good data, an AI in an organization is just garbage in, garbage out, right? That paradigm that hasn't necessarily changed, but you do have the ability now to improve data at scale that then helps, that gives you the ability to improve your chances of success in that space.
Um, how do you see Gen AI transforming customer experience in the finance industry?
Um, do you mean on looking really far in the future?
I think in the era of Gen AI, nothing is too far. So I would say next 3 years, 3 to 5 years.
Um, I think in the near term, let's say, I think a lot of what we're going to see is Copilot type implementations. Um, and that's because the technology is still pretty new. I think we're in early innings associated to this. I think organizations, regulators, customers, everyone sort of needs to get comfortable, and there's sort of a baking period associated to that. I think a lot of this is going to be human in the loop involvement. I can't see AI in financial institutions, going and making critical decisions on their own without human in the loop involvement. So I think that paradigm is probably going to exist for a little while until we have enough to go through, and then we have a lot more confidence in the regulatory framework. Customers have confidence and are accustomed to operating with an AI. I think a lot of that takes time. So, in my mind, Copilot is probably going to be in the near future.
I would believe that. You know, there is a lot of debate on the job security. Jobs are going to take it up, but I think finance industry is one of the industries where the adoption is going to be slower because of the trust and regulations, etc. So, um, in order to have customers have trust, it's going to take time. Having worked in this AI field for a while, who or what has influenced your thinking about AI, AI's role in society and business?
I'd say that there's two pieces to this. So I think just thinking historically, I think AI is the next major technological revolution. So if I think to the ones that came before this, there was the agricultural revolution, industrial, digital. Each of them brought huge, huge gains in lifestyle for humanity. And you know, I know that there's the employment question out there. I think each of those had the same types of employment questions out there, but unemployment has stayed historically low for quite some time. So I mean, from that standpoint, I'm a little bit of an optimist um, on the broader role of AI in society. I think if I if I take it down to a slightly more macro level or a micro level, I was interacting with my daughter and she was doing research for her paper. Um, I was telling her how we used to do research when I was growing up. So you had to find someone to take you to the library, you had to go to the card catalog, you had to make sure that the book that you were looking for was in stock. You had to make sure that the answer that you're looking for was in that book. And if it wasn't, then you had to repeat that whole process again until you found the answer. That process is pretty time consuming. It can take a few days, it could take a while. I think this next generation has the ability to do that process in seconds.
Mhm.
They can ask a question, get an answer almost instantaneously, And I think that has profound implications because that pace of research will then allow you to do a lot more in a much shorter amount of time. So your ability to learn goes up astronomically. And I think that, if you compound that over a number of decades, that has pretty significant implications.
Yeah, and implications on the kind of problems that you will be solving. It's going
Absolutely.
completely different. Looking back, what advice would you give to yourself when you first took on this role of head of AI at PNC Bank?
Um, I'd say investing early in the partnerships with all of the risk and compliance functions is probably the most critical, right? That's what ends up being the differentiator between implementations that stay in experimentation for long periods of time and ones that move past that. I'd say the second piece is start out small and get something that's it may seem small at the time, but it gives you a foundation to build on versus trying to do something that's transformational right off the bat. Getting a really, really, really small win, um, and then using that as a foundation to build an iterative process on is a lot more, it increases the chances of success more than, trying to hit a home run the first time around.
Yeah, absolutely. Templatize that success and replicate it. Um, there's so much going on in the AI world, and it's moving at light speed. So, as a startup founder, how do you stay focused and inspired in this changing world of AI?
Um, I mean, we're trying to focus on the problems that create business value.
Mhm.
And I define business value as, it has financial, it has customer experience or risk implications. Um, but we're really focused on things that do that, things that actually solve a business need. And if it doesn't solve a business need, I mean, it's a great experiment, but that's really all it ends up being until you can take that and define a need off of that. So I think that's what we're really focused on is not using technology for the sake of technology, but using technology to solve a real world business problem.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anuj, for joining me. It was such a thoughtful and insightful conversation. I learned so much about the finance industry today. Um, Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Have a great day.